You're listening to Where You Live with Gene and Tony.
Welcome back to Where You Live. If you're just joining us, our guest right now is Paul Brownlee, who's Director of Business Development for Reserve Advisors. And they've been doing capital replacement studies for properties not only in these 50 states, but even in Madagascar now, too. Is that right, Paul?
That's correct, yes.
And so, folks, if you have a question for Paul, please give us a call here at the station.
Yeah, call now, 651-289-4488.
And before we get back in our discussion with Paul, we also had one caller during the break who said, hey, give me the phone number one more time for All Inc. They want the Where You Live special of the month in May. And just give Brian a call at 651-775-8075, and I'll ask our producer, Bill, to go ahead and write that down if anybody else calls and wants that number too. If right before the break, though, Paul, we were talking about just some of the major changes with the state legislature last year in 2010 as it applies to reserve funds. Can you give us a quick summary of what those three items are?
Sure. Well, I think one of the most important things that in the changes to the recent legislation is the association shall budget for adequate reserves. The amount budgeted annually together with the past and future reserves shall be adequate to replace the components based on estimated remaining useful life.
And how do they determine what's adequate? You're the person that helps determine that, aren't you?
Exactly. What does adequate mean? Well, adequate means you should probably have a reserve study done.
Uh-huh.
Know where you're at and know what your status is, because adequate is not defined.
Yeah.
It's really not defined at all. And an association is obligated to replace by reason of ordinary wear and tear on those components. So adequate is really not defined, and that kind of really draws a red flag to me, saying
sure.
You should choose an independent third-party reserve study company to help you define that.
Because that will help define exactly what is adequate for your property.
One of the things that the legislature did define further, they said not only do you need to have adequate reserves, but they did come up with a time frame. They said this is something that the board should reevaluate every 3 years.
Exactly.
And so does that? Do you think that is stating that the state legislature is saying that a brand new reserve study needs to be done every 3 years? Or to me, I'm thinking that just means that it's just giving the leeway to at least take another look at what was done a few years ago to see if it is still adequate, or have there been major changes, and should there be an update?
Yeah, you're right, Gene. You're right on the money with that, because what we do as professionals is we recommend, even if you're not in Minnesota or wherever you are, you should always have your reserve study evaluated and updated by an engineer every 3 to 5 years. So what they're going to do is rerun those numbers, take a look at the association. Has there been any construction changes at the association?
Mm-hmm.
What's happened with the inflationary rates? Have those changed?
Mm-hmm.
And adjust those numbers and kind of give you a checkup.
Yeah, because I know one thing that happens actually pretty regularly is you may have put roof replacement in your reserve study, and then the next summer some big storm comes through and damages your roofs, and you have an insurance claim that replaces your roofs. That's going to greatly affect your reserve study, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Let me ask you this. Let's talk about another part of that legislation that is I think is real important, Paul, and that is the idea of borrowing. That has been prohibited. People cannot borrow from the reserve funds for the operating account.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. In fact, the association may not borrow from reserves to fund operating expenses anymore. The exception is the association has the authority to pledge replacement reserves as security for a loan. That's the only exception.
Huh.
So it's
okay.
not. So I guess it's not considered actually using the funds if it's just being used as collateral for a loan.
That, you know, it's so tempting for homeowners associations as they see that reserve fund balance grow, and that money's sitting there, and it's so tempting for them to want to use it for other purposes.
You know, the part to me that seems always seemed to be, I guess, a disconnect with what I think the state legislators intended and with what they know or don't know about the industry, and that is a lot. What some people were calling borrowing from the reserves wasn't borrowing; it was just taking and saying, "Well, we will not raise our operating dues because we'll just take the $15,000 extra that we need this year and just take it from the reserves." That's not borrowing; that's taking.
That's true.
But
that's
some associations, I think there's a place for being able to borrow. And a perfect example, you go through a real harsh winter like we just did. You have utility costs that end up going through the roof, and you're in a high-rise condo that's supplying heat for everyone. They could have a bill that could be $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 more than they had anticipated.
Yeah.
You can't just have the utility company just shut off the service for non-payment.
Right.
You can't ask the homeowners immediately to come up with that money. Sometimes I think it could be a place for the association to borrow.
But they have to have a
And then-
repayment plan. I mean,
Yes.
the CPAs have been telling us that all along. You can borrow, if you borrow from the reserve fund, you have to have a plan to pay it back to make it.
And before this
financially
legislation took
responsible.
place, that's exactly what we did with a number of our clients.
Now we can't.
Now
Now our clients
you
can't do
even
that.
you can't even do that.
That's a
so
shame.
that's just
And from a professional standpoint, we think that's a good idea. We like to see that you have to keep those reserves just for the reserve funds, because that's what we're trying to help the association do. And in fact, I talked to a lot of our engineers and asked them what's the most, in Minnesota, where do you see the most borrowing come from prior to this? And they said for sure snow removal. When large amounts of snowstorms, they're always borrowing from that. From the reserve.
Because that's
it was
that's unpredictable.
The winter event they could not predict.
Yeah.
There's one
But
other.
they need to plan for that in their operating assessments. Yeah.
There is one other aspect, Paul, would like you to talk about, and that is the legislature also has allowed there to be sort of a waiver in having some components removed from the reserve study. Can you talk about that? There's
yes. In that regards to the limited common elements, are not, or unless the declaration otherwise states, limited common elements are to be assessed back to unit owners. Therefore, as I mentioned before, our engineers will take a look at this before doing the reserve study. You need to check the declarations regarding what needs to be put into the reserve fund and what doesn't need. Reserve funds need to be an account separate from the operating account as well.
Well, I was thinking that some of it was even more than just limited common elements. There could be a common. My understanding in reading the legislation that there could be a common element. Let's say driveways. Okay, and if the association decided to have the homeowners and they voted to have that taken care of by special assessment, they could have that removed and out of the reserve as listed as a component. Isn't that correct?
Oh, yes, right. You're correct.
Okay.
But it has to be a plan. It has to make sense, and your members have to agree to it, right? I mean, there's a process to be followed, I guess is the point I want to make.
Yeah.
Right. A board can define certain components as special assessment elements rather than reserving for them. Here's the requirements. Requires board approval. Requires 51% homeowner approval. Good for a year approved plus 3 years. Can be extended for 3 more years at any point by same vote. Can be overturned by same vote. and must be disclosed at the resale of the unit.
There you go. Okay. That's right. That's right.
Well, Paul, thanks so much for taking some time to be with us this Sunday morning to talk about reserve funds. I'm looking at our time here. Looks like we're going to need to take another break. Folks, if you like to talk to us today, the number is 651-289-4488. We'll be back after these messages.